Okay, so for the last 2 weeks in this class, we've been learning about Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase, Lewis and Clark, and things like that. And today, we're going to specifically concentrate on what happened during James Madison's presidency, which was the War of 1812. Now, a couple things to note about the War of 1812. Number one, this is the first time that the United States ever declares war on another country, and we declare war on Great Britain. The reason why this happens is because there's still a war going on between France and Great Britain in Europe, and it's causing problems for American traders because we're trying to trade goods with France. Americans are trying to trade goods with Great Britain, and they're unable to do it with both because their ships are being taken in the ocean. So that leads us to our first slide today, which is about the USS Constitution. Now, what I would urge you to do is, if you have not already done so, you can print this PowerPoint off. It's in Schoology as a link. You can print it off and fill it in on a piece of paper as we go through. The other thing that you may want to consider doing is you can also, while you're watching this video, you can just take a sheet of paper and write down each of the blanks that we fill in for the PowerPoint as we go, and then you can fill them in later if you would like to do it that way digitally. So those are your choices. There will be a quiz at the end of the PowerPoint, and so however you want to get the answers that we fill in as we go, that's up to you. You can either write them down on a piece of paper, fill them in digitally later, or you can also just pause this video, go to Schoology, and the link to this PowerPoint is there. You can print that link out, and then you can fill in the answers as you go. So, back to the USS Constitution. We're in the War of 1812 has not quite started yet, but we're almost there. The American ships, as I said, are being taken, and the United States decides they're going to build a small navy, and they decide to start with a large fighting ship called the USS Constitution. And the USS Constitution was unparalleled in terms of how powerful it was. The Constitution is pictured right here in the video, and it was undefeated in its fights and its naval battles during the War of 1812. It defeated every British ship that it ever came in contact with. The Constitution had a bronze plate in the front of it, so if it ran into things, it couldn't be sunk that way. There were many guns on the ship, and it was a very, very powerful fighting ship. The Constitution, ironically, is still actually in commission by the U.S. Navy today. It's in Boston Harbor. It no longer sails on any missions, but it is kind of a museum that you can visit in Boston Harbor today. Part of the reason why the Constitution was needed is because not only were there problems with France and Great Britain, but we were also having our ships harassed by the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean Sea area, North African pirates who kind of kidnapped Americans and demanded a ransom for them in return. The Barbary pirates were eventually defeated by the USS Constitution. Now, the third bullet point here is about what we've already mentioned. 1803, a war between France and Great Britain start again. Basically, this whole year, we've been talking about France and Great Britain being at war with each other. So from the time of Columbus, 1492, to where we're at talking about right now, 1803, and then the War of 1812, France and Great Britain are almost always at war. They go to war with each other quite a bit, and every time they're at war, it affects people that live in America and other places around the world. So what the British were doing that was hurting American trade interests, and the French were doing this too, but the British more so. The British would stop American ships, they would take their cargo, and they would force the sailors, to fight for the British Navy. The vocab word for this is called impressment. They would impress the soldiers into fighting for the British Navy. And when they would do this, when they would impress the British soldiers to fight for the British Navy, they would impress the American sailors, I should say, to fight for the British Navy. When they would do that, American sailors obviously didn't appreciate this, and this led to some problems with the United States, and eventually it's going to lead to the War of 1812. Now, the other thing that was really hurting things in the United States was called the Embargo Act. And we learned about the Embargo Act was as part of Thomas Jefferson's presidency. And the Embargo Act basically banned trade with all other countries. And Thomas Jefferson thought and hoped that by doing this, that would encourage some of the people in Great Britain and France to stop impressing American ships, and that we could begin trading with everyone again. Well, of course, this didn't work, and by not trading with any other countries, the only country that was hurt was America, was in fact the United States. And because of this, because the Embargo Act, several senators began calling for war against Great Britain. And these senators earned a nickname. They were called war hawks. They were called war hawks because they wanted to go to war with Great Britain or France, or they just wanted to go to war with just about anybody. But they wanted to go with war with Great Britain in this particular case. The war hawks were led by a man named Henry Clay. And Henry Clay is, we talk about Henry Clay because Henry Clay was a guy who really, really wanted to become president. He ran for president 5 different times and was never elected, but he was one of the strongest war hawks that was in the Congress. While this was all going on, we also had a situation going on with Native Americans. As we've talked about again for most of the course this year class, Native Americans were constantly in conflict with Americans as Americans continued to move west, and Native American lands were in the way, and they tried to fight with them to gain those lands. And as this was going on, leading up to the War of 1812, we had something else going on. The British were still giving guns and ammunition and weapons to the Native Americans, who were then turning around and fighting against American settlers. One Native American in particular was really instigating and trying to fight back against the Americans. His name was Tecumseh. And Tecumseh was a Native American who he realized that by himself, with his other tribes, he could not defeat the Americans. So he went up and down the Mississippi River Valley and the Ohio River Valley to try to unite multiple tribes to fight against the Americans. And in some ways he was very successful with this because he was able to get a number of tribes together to fight. One of the other things about Tecumseh is he had a brother that was also very influential at the time amongst Native Americans, and his name was the Prophet, or his nickname was the Prophet is what I should say. And Tecumseh and the Prophet worked together to try to unite tribes against the Americans. Well, in the Indiana Territory is where one of the main battles took place, and that battle was called the Battle of Tippecanoe, which is right up here on the slide. The Battle of Tippecanoe was very important because this battle was where William Henry Harrison led American soldiers against Tecumseh and his forces. And in the end, at the Battle of Tippecanoe, as has been the case for almost all of the things we've talked about this year with Native Americans, the Native Americans lost, and the Americans were able to take the land that the Native Americans had. Again, as we've mentioned before, this is a sad thing, but it is something that we need to talk about throughout the course of American history, because the United States did force Native Americans off many of their tribal lands. Okay, so the next slide that we're going to talk about is the actual War of 1812 starting. So the causes of the War of 1812 are that the British are impressing American ships, number one, and number two, they're also helping Native Americans fight against American frontier settlers. And so the war begins, and the British have all the advantages. The British had thousands of ships in their navy. The United States had about 20. Okay? And in spite of this, the Americans did win a key naval victory at the Battle of Lake Erie, right here in Pennsylvania. The Americans were able to beat the British at the Battle of Lake Erie. The commander of the troops during the Battle of Lake Erie for the Americans, His name was Oliver Hazard Perry. Oliver Hazard Perry. And if you've never been to the Great Lakes before, you may think, why was there a battle on a lake? Well, Lake Erie is one of the Great Lakes, so it's huge. This is much bigger than any lake that that is from around here. And so the lake was huge, and the Americans fought against the British, and under Oliver Hazard Perry, they're able to defeat the British at the Battle of Lake Erie. Now, while this is going on in the north, there's also things going on in the south. The Native Americans are still fighting their own wars against the Americans, and one of those is called the Creek War. The Creek War took place in Alabama, and the Americans were led by a Tennessee militia commander. This militia commander you've probably heard of before because he would go on to become the 7th president. His name was Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson made a name for himself during the War of 1812, specifically during this particular battle or war with the Creek War, and then later on, in another battle, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. But the Creeks were defeated. The Creek were defeated, and they gave up millions of acres of land when they signed the Treaty of Fort Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson was not a friend of Native Americans in any way, and we'll talk more about him later on in the next week or so, in the next couple of weeks. But Andrew Jackson, during the Creek War, defeated the Indians very handily, and once they were defeated, he forced them to sign over their land to the American government. Okay, so this, just as a quick summary, this slide, we're talking specifically about two things. You have in the north a great American victory at the Battle of Lake Erie, one of the few American victories that happened during the War of 1812. And in the south, the Creek War took place in Alabama. Americans were led by the Tennessee military commander Andrew Jackson, who basically defeats the Creek easily and forces them to sign a land treaty where they lose millions of acres of their land. Now, during the War of 1812, the British, as I mentioned previously, really were kind of defeating the Americans very handily. And one of the things that was included in that was, or the reason why that started, is because the British, when they get done, they finish off the French. Okay, they finish off the French in Europe, and they decide to turn their full attention to the United States. At the beginning of the War of 1812, the first 2 years, the British are still fighting against the French in Europe. And so they kind of ignore the United States. We declare war against them, and they kind of just ignored us. But 2 years later, in 1814, they finish off the French, and they come to America with their full power. And when they get here, they really start to win many, many battles and defeat us easily. They attacked numerous places, but some of the places they included were Washington, D.C. They march into Washington, D.C., and they basically burn the city to the ground, including some of the most famous buildings that we know of, including the White House. The picture you see here, you can see the White House burning in the background here. Goats are running and people are running away, and the White House is being burned. Now, while the White House is burning, First Lady Dolly Madison does something tremendous. Dolly Madison basically says, I'm not going to leave the White House. Before the British get there and light the White House on fire, she says, I'm not evacuating. I'm not leaving until we take this very famous picture of George Washington. It was a painting of George Washington that was hung in the White House. She said, we have to take this out of here. And she said, if we take this painting out of here, we can save some of the history, because the British were going to burn everything else down. And so she saves that White House picture of that painting of George Washington, and that painting still hangs in the White House, in the new White House, the rebuilt White House today. So 200 years later, we have Dolly Madison to thank for that particular painting being saved. Now, the other thing that happens is once the British are done kind of burning Washington, D.C. down, they turn their attention to Baltimore. And in Baltimore, Maryland, there was a fort there named Fort McHenry. And Fort McHenry was a fortress. That's what fort is short for, is fortress. And it really was a fortress. The British were out in Baltimore Harbor, and they bombed Fort McHenry for 25 hours straight. The Americans refused to surrender, and the British eventually retreat out of Baltimore Harbor. This is a tremendous, tremendous victory for the Americans. And while this is going on, something really incredible is happening. The a man named Francis Scott Key, you've probably heard that name before. Francis Scott Key is out in Baltimore Harbor, and he's watching this whole thing play out from on board a ship. And as those bombs are being dropped in on Fort McHenry, some of them don't explode when they hit the ground like they're supposed to. Some of them explode in the air, and he creates something similar to a fireworks display. And as Francis Scott Key is watching this, he is inspired by it, and he writes down some words that would eventually become the words of the Star-Spangled Banner, which is our national anthem today. And if you think about some of the lines in the national anthem, you can see how he might say that, because when he says the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, he was seeing that. And the main thing that he said in the Star-Spangled Banner is that the flag was still there. So think about it. 25 hours straight of being attacked and bombed, and the Americans at Fort McHenry would refuse to lower the flag. If you lowered your flag, that means that you were surrendering. And the flag was still waving in the air. After all of these bombs being dropped on Fort McHenry, the British finally just abandoned the harbor. And this is the inspiration for our national anthem, the song that's played before every single sporting event that you go to. Well, while this was going on, we also had a situation where the British were trying to take control of the Mississippi River at the port of New Orleans. Okay, they knew if they could control New Orleans, they could control the whole Mississippi River, and the whole Mississippi River would really shut down the western part of the United States. Well, once again, we heard about Andrew Jackson a slide or two ago. Once again, Andrew Jackson was called on to take care of things. And because Andrew Jackson was such a bulldog and such a fighter, he was given a nickname of Old Hickory. Okay, like an old tree that's stuck in the ground, Old Hickory. And he helps lead the Americans to a tremendous battle victory at the Battle of New Orleans. Okay, the Battle of New Orleans takes place, and the Americans win handily. The British suffer more than 2,000 casualties. That's 2,000 men that are either killed, wounded, or missing after the battle. The Americans, on the other hand, only suffer about 70 casualties. That is incredible. That's an incredible victory for the Americans, and that victory was very important part of the war. However, that victory came 2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent was signed. The Treaty of Ghent is the treaty that ended the war. It was signed in Belgium, and that officially ended the war. Now, you may be asking yourself, why did they fight a battle 2 weeks after the treaty was signed? Well, remember, it takes a long time to get a message across the ocean. In fact, it could take 2, 3, sometimes 4 weeks to get a message across the ocean. And then they had to get the message all the way down to New Orleans from Washington, D.C. And so the Battle of New Orleans is maybe the most important battle of the whole war, and it's fought 2 weeks after the war is over. Isn't that funny? Well, I guess it wasn't funny for those who lost their lives, but it is ironic that the battle is fought 2 weeks after the war is technically already over, the Treaty of Ghent having already been signed. Now, neither side really won the War of 1812. The British won lots of victories. The Americans won a couple victories. But the British end up leaving. They don't gain any new territory. They don't get America back. They don't really get anything out of the deal other than they just go home. And so the War of 1812 really had no winners. Unfortunately, though, there were losers in the War of 1812. The losers were the Native Americans. And the reason why the Native Americans were the losers is because, once again, they lost more land. And with the British really finally leaving the United States for good now, with the British finally leaving for good the United States, the Native Americans had nobody else left to help them. And so the Americans, as they pushed west, Sometimes they were friendly with Native Americans, we've talked about that, and many times they were not friendly with the Native Americans. The Native American was kind of forced to give up the land that they occupied. So the War of 1812 in a summary, what were the causes and what were the effects? Here's the causes. The War of 1812 was caused by the impressment of American sailors. It also was caused by the interference of American shipping. And finally, it was caused because the British were aiding the Native Americans in the United States. What were the effects of war? What's the outcome of the war? Well, the outcome is, number one, that there was an increased sense of national pride. Many more people were excited about being Americans. They had this sense of pride, like Francis Scott Key at the Battle of Fort McHenry, seeing the flag flying in the air. They had this sense of American pride, much the same way that we look at patriotism today. They also, another effect of the War of 1812 was that American manufacturing was boosted. Our economy picked up because after the war we were able to trade with both Great Britain and France once again. And then finally, another thing that happened was that Native Americans, their strongholds and their resistance to Americans moving west was very much weakened by the British leaving the country and the Americans defeating the Native Americans. So, with that being said, that's kind of a summary of the War of 1812 and a little bit before it, what caused it, and a little bit of what the effects were as well. What I'd like you to do at this point is, if you missed anything, you can go back in the video, make sure you write in the blanks that we filled in. If you got everything, you can go ahead and end this video and take the quiz that accompanies this in the Schoology assignment.